There's a character on Family Guy who makes audiences laugh and squirm at the exact same time, and the squirm usually wins. Herbert, the frail old man with the whistling voice and the walker, is built entirely around a single deeply uncomfortable joke: his obsession with Chris and the neighborhood boys. Today we're going through every time Herbert was way too creepy in Family Guy, and we're going to ask the harder question underneath it. How did a character this disturbing become a recurring fixture, and what does it say about the show that he works at all? Because Herbert is one of the most divisive things Family Guy ever created. Some viewers find him hilarious, others find him genuinely indefensible, and both reactions are completely understandable. The character lives on the thinnest, most dangerous line in all of comedy. By the end of this, you'll understand exactly how the show keeps him on the funny side of that line, the specific tricks it uses, and why those tricks sometimes fail, leaving behind moments that are just plain unsettling. We're going to break Herbert's creepiness into 3 levels. The harmless gags, where the joke is mostly about him being oblivious and pathetic. The uncomfortable escalations, where the show pushes the obsession further than it should. And the moments that cross the line entirely, where even longtime fans agree it went too far. Understanding why some Herbert jokes land and others curdle is the whole point. Let's start with the harmless gags, the foundation of the character. At his most palatable, Herbert is funny because of how utterly delusional and ineffectual he is. The joke isn't really about predatory behavior succeeding, it's about a creepy old man whose intentions are completely transparent to everyone, whose advances go nowhere, and who is, fundamentally, a sad and lonely figure. In these gags, the comedy comes from the contrast between his elaborate fantasies and his total inability to act on them. His high, warbling voice, his physical frailty, his cluelessness, all of it renders him more pathetic than threatening. And here's the first signpost. The harmless Herbert works because the show keeps him powerless. The instant the audience senses that Herbert poses no real danger, that he's all creepy talk and zero capability, the discomfort gets a release valve and turns into laughter. His powerlessness is the safety mechanism. Hold on to that, because every time a Herbert joke fails, it's because that safety mechanism slipped, and the threat suddenly felt a little too real. Now let's move to the uncomfortable escalations, where the show starts testing the limits. These are the moments where Herbert's obsession gets more pointed, more persistent, more focused on Chris specifically. The show leans into the stalking, the lurking, the elaborate schemes to get close to his target. These escalations are designed to make the audience squirm harder, to push the discomfort right up to the edge of what's bearable. And they work on a knife's edge, because the comedy now depends entirely on the audience continuing to believe that nothing will ever actually happen. What makes the escalations fascinating is how the show tries to keep them funny. It surrounds Herbert's creepiness with absurdity, with his ridiculous voice, with Chris's own obliviousness, with the surreal cartoon logic that keeps reminding you none of this is real. The show works hard to maintain the buffer of unreality, because without it, the jokes would collapse into something genuinely upsetting. The escalations are a high-wire act, and you can almost feel the show calculating exactly how far it can push before the laughter dies. Here's the plan for the end. The escalations reveal that Herbert's entire existence depends on a delicate balance, and that balance is far more fragile than the show sometimes admits. Remember that the character only works under very specific conditions, because the payoff is about what happens when those conditions break, and what that failure reveals about this kind of comedy in general. Now the hardest tier, the moments that cross the line entirely. There are Herbert moments that even fans who love the character will admit went too far, where the obsession was depicted too vividly, too seriously, or with too little of the absurdist buffer that keeps it bearable. In these moments, the safety mechanism failed completely. The powerlessness slipped, the unreality thinned, and what was left was just the raw, ugly subject matter with none of the comedy to soften it. These are the moments that gave Herbert his reputation as one of the show's most indefensible creations, and they're worth being honest about rather than pretending they don't exist. And this brings us to the payoff, the real question of how a character like this works at all. The answer is that Herbert is comedy operating at the absolute boundary of what comedy can do, and that boundary is defined by one thing: the gap between the threat and the capability. Herbert is funny only in the space where the subject is dark, but the danger is zero. The moment the show lets the danger feel real, even slightly, the entire structure collapses because there is nothing funny about the actual thing Herbert represents. The character is a controlled demonstration of how comedy can briefly defang even the darkest subjects, but only by keeping them completely powerless, completely unreal, completely contained. That's why Herbert is so divisive, and why the discomfort is actually doing something. The character forces the audience to sit in the tension between the joke and the reality it's built on. Every laugh comes with a flinch, and that flinch is the audience's conscience reminding them what's actually being joked about. The best defense of Herbert is that the discomfort is the point, that the character is a kind of dare, testing how much darkness comedy can hold before it breaks. The strongest criticism is that some subjects shouldn't be made into recurring gags at all, no matter how powerless the character. And honestly, both of those positions are defensible, which is exactly what makes Herbert such a perfect case study. Let me break down the specific techniques the show uses to keep Herbert on the funny side of the line, because understanding the mechanics reveals exactly how fragile the whole thing is. The first technique is the voice. Herbert's high, breathy, whistling delivery is doing enormous comedic work. It instantly signals frailty, age, and harmlessness, undercutting the threat before he even finishes a sentence. A predator with a deep, menacing voice would be pure horror. A predator who sounds like a leaking balloon is, the show bets, absurd enough to laugh at. The voice is the single most important tool in keeping Herbert palatable, a constant audio reminder that this figure is more pathetic than dangerous. Strip away that voice and give Herbert a normal one, and almost none of the jokes would survive the change. The second technique is total ineffectiveness. Herbert never succeeds. Ever. His schemes always fail, his advances always go nowhere, and Chris remains perpetually, blissfully oblivious to what Herbert actually wants. This guaranteed failure is essential because it means the dark outcome the character implies can never actually arrive. The audience can relax into the joke knowing the show will never let the unthinkable happen. Herbert is a threat permanently frozen at the moment before anything occurs, and that freeze is what makes the laughter possible. The instant the show suggested he might actually succeed, the comedy would die instantly and permanently. The third technique is Chris's obliviousness, which functions as a kind of moral shield for the audience. Because Chris never understands what Herbert wants, he's never actually frightened, never actually victimized in his own mind. The show uses Chris's innocence to keep the dynamic from feeling like genuine predation, because the supposed victim isn't experiencing it as a threat at all. It's a clever, uncomfortable trick, using one character's cluelessness to give the audience permission to laugh, and it works right up until the moments when the show lets the reality intrude too far. The fourth technique is making Herbert sympathetic. The show frequently frames Herbert as profoundly lonely, a forgotten old man with nothing in his life, and that loneliness invites a flicker of pity that complicates the disgust. By giving him moments of genuine pathos, the show muddies the audience's reaction, making it harder to simply condemn him and easier to file him under tragic rather than monstrous. This is the riskiest technique of all, because sympathy for a predatory figure is exactly the kind of thing that can curdle into something genuinely uncomfortable if pushed too far. When all four techniques work together, the voice, the failure, the obliviousness, and the pathos, Herbert stays on the comedic side of the line. When even one of them slips, when the threat feels too real, when Chris seems genuinely endangered, when the pathos tips into something that feels like an excuse, the whole structure wobbles, and the audience is left holding a joke that isn't funny anymore. That fragility is the defining feature of the character, and it's why no two viewers ever quite agree on him. So here's the bigger idea this teaches you, about Family Guy, and about the limits of comedy itself. There's a line where dark comedy stops being comedy, and Herbert is the character who lives closest to it, sometimes on the right side, sometimes on the wrong one. He's the show's ongoing experiment in just how far the cartoon shield can stretch, and the fact that it sometimes fails is more honest than if it always worked. Comedy that takes real risks will occasionally cross the line, and Herbert is the proof, a character who is sometimes brilliantly uncomfortable and sometimes just uncomfortable, with a very thin margin between the two. He's the canary in the coal mine for the entire show, the clearest signal of exactly where Family Guy's appetite for darkness finally meets its limit, and the fact that the show kept walking right up to that limit with him, over and over, tells you everything about how fearless and how reckless it was willing to be in the name of a laugh. It's also worth asking why the show created Herbert in the first place, because the answer says a lot about Family Guy's whole comedic philosophy. The show has always been built on the principle that no subject is automatically off limits. The comedy's job is to go to the places other shows are too afraid to touch. Herbert is the purest expression of that philosophy, a character who exists specifically to test whether the darkest possible subject can be made funny under the right conditions. He's not a casual creation, he's a deliberate provocation, a dare the show made to itself and to its audience. Whether the dare was worth making is exactly the debate that surrounds him. And there's something revealing in the fact that the show kept him around for so long. Herbert clearly worked, at least often enough to justify his recurring presence, which means a large portion of the audience kept laughing. That uncomfortable fact is worth sitting with, because it suggests that the appetite for boundary-pushing comedy is real and widespread, that audiences are drawn to the thrill of watching a show flirt with the truly forbidden. Herbert is a mirror held up not just to the show's willingness to go too far, but to the audience's willingness to follow it there. The character implicates everyone who laughed, and maybe that discomfort, that complicity, is part of what the show was actually after all along. The oddest conclusion is that Herbert is neither simply defensible nor simply indefensible. He's a genuine experiment in the outer limits of comedy, one that succeeds and fails in roughly equal measure. And the fact that we're still debating him years later is itself a kind of proof that the experiment mattered. A forgettable character provokes no argument. Herbert provokes nothing but argument, and that, for better or worse, is a mark of how effectively he does the unsettling job he was built to do. So next time Herbert shuffles onto the screen, pay attention to your own reaction, the laugh and the flinch arriving together. Notice whether the show kept him powerless and unreal enough to stay funny, or whether it let the threat feel real and tipped the joke into something darker. That moment of noticing is the whole experience of this character, the constant negotiation between what's funny and what's too far. And the fact that the negotiation never fully resolves, that you're never quite sure whether you should be laughing, is exactly what the show intended. Herbert is designed to keep you uncomfortable, and the discomfort is the most honest thing about him. The show refusing to let you off the hook, refusing to make the darkness fully safe, leaving you to decide for yourself where your own line actually is. So where do you land on Herbert? Is he a brilliant piece of boundary-pushing dark comedy, or a character the show never should have kept around? And which moment do you think crossed the line for good? Tell me in the comments, because this is one of the most genuinely debatable characters in the whole show, and I want to hear every side. If this gave you a new way to think about where comedy's limits actually are, hit that like button and share it with the friend who can never quite decide whether they should be laughing at Herbert or not. And stick around, because we're moving from the show's creepiest character to its most chaotic question. Next, we're ranking every Griffin from weakest to strongest.